Hi, welcome to this WebEx presentation on family violence presented by Military Family Services Europe as part of Family Violence Prevention and Awareness Week. My name is Miriam Shibat. I am the MFSD social worker. So first of all, as we will be addressing the sensitive issue of family violence, and these issues can be difficult to talk about. So I just want to warn people that this may be triggering or distressing for some people, especially to survivors of violence. If you feel the need to, please reach out either to me directly or use the resources that are made available at the end of this presentation. Okay, so what is family violence, right? So when we talk about family violence, we refer to deliberate acts of power and control by one family member over another. And so this includes intimate partner violence, child abuse, and elder abuse. So it is, to a lesser degree, about anger management, but it is more about power and control than about anger. So perpetrators of family violence can often be perceived as really charming and nice people, and successfully control impulses of anger in other spheres of their life. For example, someone can be violent within the family, but not with a boss, for example. So it's less about anger and more about power and power inequality. So family violence affects every strata of society, regardless of age, income, level of education. It is not specific to any culture, to any ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, region, or country. And although all genders can be perpetrators or victims of intimate partner violence, it is largely a gendered issue. So according to StatCan, 83% of victims of intimate partner violence are women. So now there are different theories that attempt to explain family violence and intimate partner violence, but some of these frame the question in terms of how the family reproduces social norms. So according to some feminist theories, intimate partner violence is seen as the direct result of a patriarchal society that promotes gender inequality. So in this aspect, intimate partner violence is not an intimate issue at all, but a social issue resulting from unequal power distribution between men and women. The famous author, Bell Hooks, suggests replacing the term domestic violence to patriarchal violence, as she claims that using the words domestic make it seem like a private matter, whereas it is a social problem. So it's a social problem, according to this, and a social problem, and it also has an enormous social cost. According to StatCan, it is estimated that the total cost of spousal violence against women in Canada is $4.8 billion every year. $4.8 billion every single year. So it's an enormous social cost, not only for the victims, but for the families and for society in general. So when we look at the different forms of violence within the family, there are different forms such as physical, sexual, emotional, or psychological abuse, financial abuse, and neglect of vulnerable dependents. So what's physical abuse? So when we refer to physical abuse, this would be intentional bodily harm. So this with or without a weapon, such as hitting, slapping, burning, pushing, all of these to the extent of murder and homicide. When we talk about children, so this also includes inappropriate physical discipline of a child. Physical abuse. So this sexual abuse is any sexual activity with an adult without their consent. So with someone who does not consent or who cannot consent. In terms of family violence, this can be any sexual activity to which a partner has not given consent or has retracted consent, or is not in a state to give consent. So this includes using coercion to have sex, or any transgression of boundaries that were previously negotiated upon, or a disregard for a safe word. Sexual abuse in the family includes any sexual activity involving a child, so with or without contact. For example, an adult exposing a child to sexual acts, to sexual material, or other pornography or other sexual material. Emotional or psychological abuse. This could be repeated denigration, put-downs, power games, mind games, such as gaslighting, for example, where the victim doubts his or her perception of reality and mental sanity, isolating the person from friends and family, harassment, stalking, threats of harm, violence towards pets and objects. And when we talk about children, this includes the exposure of children to intimate partner violence. Psychological mistreatment also includes affective neglect, indifference, and emotional rejection. Financial abuse is usually a more subtle form of violence, and this can include, for example, taking someone's pay without their permission, or withholding someone's money or shared monies in order to control, or identity theft, for example. So neglect, so this is for dependents who are vulnerable and depend on the care of another family member. So this can be neglect in terms of basic physiological needs such as food, clothing, or shelter, or failing to provide treatment or schooling to a child. So what is the cycle of violence? So this model was developed in 1979 by someone called Lenore E. Walker, who interviewed 1,500 women who were victims of domestic violence. So this can explain patterns of behavior in an abusive relationship. So it illustrates the different stages of domestic violence, and the key element here is that it is a cycle. So it is a cycle that is bound to repeat itself again and again, and with greater intensity, unless a major change is made. So we can start here with the tension building phase. So this is where the daily irritants add up. So the victim could be on the lookout for any minute nonverbal signs that the tension will break. The victim may try to make him or herself more nurturing or invisible in order to appease the tension. So this is where victims will typically say, "I feel like I'm walking on eggshells." The next phase is the explosion, where an act of violence cuts through the tension. And then the next phase is the honeymoon phase, where during this phase, the perpetrator typically feels guilt and remorse for the violence and may compensate by showering the victim with gifts and acts of kindness, and may promise to change. So the victim will typically say during this phase, "Well, it's not that bad. Look how amazing of a partner and a parent he or she is, and besides, I'm kind of responsible for this anyways." So during this phase, during the honeymoon phase, all is well for a short period of time until the next cycle begins. So some people on the outside looking in could think, well, we know that the cycle is it's horrible. So someone may ask, why is it that victims don't simply leave? So before we blame the victim, I'd like to take a little detour and talk about rats, frogs, and prisoners of war to better understand the dynamics of family violence. So it's a pattern that is unpredictable. We've seen this in the cycle of abuse, so there's an alternation between good and bad, and hot and cold, and horrible and amazing, between Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So this can explain why spouses who experience domestic violence stay, due to something that is called intermittent reinforcement. So to better understand what is intermittent reinforcement, let's look at how rats can be trained to become addicted to pushing levers. So if you put a lab rat in a cage, and every time the rat pushes a lever, a treat comes out. So now the rat is content and learns that a certain behavior, so pushing the lever, equals a reward, so a treat. If you remove all the treats, the rat learns that pushing the lever does nothing, and will then stop pushing the lever and engage in other rat activities. However, if you make the pattern unpredictable, that sometimes the rat pushes the lever and gets a treat, and sometimes the rat pushes the lever and gets nothing, this is when something really interesting happens. So one might predict that in this situation, the rat would lose interest in the lever, but what happens is something completely different. So in the situation where sometimes there's a treat and sometimes there's nothing, the rat becomes completely obsessed with the lever, to the extent that the rat will stop eating and grooming in favor of repeatedly pushing the lever. So the unpredictability of this pattern is what gets us hooked. So this alternation between horrible and amazing draws a pattern where the victim becomes drawn in and is always hoping for the next honeymoon phase of moments of kindness and affection, which become fewer and farther between as time draws on. And with each cycle, this traumatic bonding is reinforced and creates a strong emotional bond that is very difficult to change. So this victim is in a sense brainwashed, and with each cycle, the perpetrator's grip is strengthened. So let's talk about this brainwashing process by talking about prisoners of war. A researcher by the name of Bitterman came up with a tool to identify the methods used to brainwash and torture prisoners of war in 1957. So we won't go into detail here. If you want more information, the reference is at the end of this presentation. But what's interesting is that people after him, working with victims of domestic violence, looked at this and thought, well, this also perfectly explains the psychological torture that is used in domestic violence. How victims are brainwashed and broken down and lose their self-esteem and the very ability to make changes, such as leaving. Bitterman writes, most people who brainwash use methods similar to those of prison guards who recognize that physical control is never easily accomplished without the cooperation of the prisoner. The most effective way to gain that cooperation is through subversive manipulation of the mind and feelings of the victim, who then becomes a psychological as well as physical prisoner. So perpetrators of family violence use strategies that are similar to those used by torturers, human trafficking, people who are perpetrators of human trafficking, or cult leaders, to manipulate the victim emotionally and psychologically, where he or she is left isolated with little self-esteem and mistrusting his or her own judgment and dependent on the perpetrator. So often the abusers are, in fact, at first, in the first stages of courting, they can be really nice and charming people who can go overboard with attention and kindness in these initial phases, which is sometimes referred to as love bombing. So abusers may seek out more vulnerable people who are particularly attentive and receptive to this kind of attention. Once trust has been established, this is when things start to get a little murky. Once trust is present, the victim is subjugated to subtle and increasing increments of control. The victim then does not know who to trust and begins to mistrust his or her judgment. So the subtle increments of power and control as the victim is broken down psychologically makes it difficult to act. So apparently, and I haven't tried this myself, so apparently if you place a frog in boiling water, if you place a frog in boiling water, the frog will sense danger and will jump out immediately. If you place a frog in cold water and slowly increase the temperature, there will be no specific moment where the frog will think to itself, this is danger. The frog will sense danger and will jump out. In this situation, the frog would let itself be boiled to death. So this is similar to domestic violence, as it is a web that is woven slowly around the victim in small increments, and the victim becomes trapped before there is a specific moment where he or she can say, this is too much and I'm out. I'd like to encourage you to take a stand against family violence. The majority of incidents are not reported. The victim may feel shame, may feel guilt, may feel powerless, and may feel that there are just no options available and that there is no way out. Victims, on average, leave 7 times before leaving for good. By reporting family violence, you are giving a voice to those whose voice has been stolen, and you can help end this cycle. So what can you do? If there's any immediate danger, call the local police immediately. The police can help you access services like shelters or other local resources in your community. If a child confides in you, stay calm, let the child speak, let him or her know that you believe him or her. Children rarely make up stories about abuse. Listen, don't ask any specific or leading questions, as this may interfere with an eventual police investigation. Report this to any child protective services, local child protective services. You have a moral obligation to report suspected child protection cases to the local authorities. If you are a professional working with children, you have a legal obligation too. So depending on the local laws, you can be held accountable for not reporting. If you yourself are a victim of family violence, know that it is not your fault, you are not alone, and help is available. Here are some of the resources available. These are geared towards Germany, but if you would like assistance or help in finding resources in your community, please reach out to me directly, and I would be happy to help. So police, emergency medical services, family information line offers 24/7 support. Local women's shelters or women's centers can help. Support lines, crisis lines, here are some that are in Germany. Your member assistance program, the local padre, myself, or the CAF, social worker, or mental health services. Here's my contact. Please feel free to reach out with any questions, comments, requests for counseling. Please feel free to contact me. And here are some the resources and further reading if you're interested. So thank you, and I look forward to hearing feedback and questions, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.